She stood in the middle of the crowd, and every single person laughed, not behind her back. Not in whispers. They laughed directly at her face, loud and shameless, and nobody moved to stop it. A woman who had done nothing wrong. A woman whose only crime was existing in a body the world decided was too much, and then, he walked in, 6'4". Silent. Dangerous. A man the entire town feared, and what he did next, nobody saw coming. This is a story about humiliation, survival, and a love so fierce it rewrites everything. Stay until the end. Like, subscribe, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. The October wind cut through Millhaven like a blade, carrying the last brittle leaves of autumn down muddy roads that hadn't seen gravel in years. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your name, your sins, and your mother's sins before you did, and they never let you forget any of them. Margaret Calloway knew this better than most. She stood at the edge of the trading post's wooden platform, her arms wrapped around the worn shawl draped across her shoulders, fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from the effort it took to hold herself together. She was 31 years old. She had buried her mother 2 winters ago. She had no husband, no father, no brothers to speak on her behalf. What she did have was a sturdy body built from years of hard labor. A quiet competence that kept her alive when softer women might have crumbled, and a reputation in Millhaven that had nothing to do with either of those things. Her reputation was this: Margaret Calloway was the fattest woman in 3 counties, and the town never missed a chance to remind her. It had started when she was a girl. Small cruelties at first, a whispered comment from a mother shielding her child's eyes. A shopkeeper who charged her more because, he said, she ate more. Children who threw stones and called her names that burrowed into her chest like splinters she could never quite dig out. By the time she was 20, the cruelties had calcified into something worse: expectation. People expected her to be ashamed. They expected her to shrink, apologize, disappear. And when she didn't, when she simply lived, walked through town with her head held up, bought her flour and carried her wood and did her work, they punished her for it. Today, the punishment came in the form of Reverend Elias Pratt. He stood on the platform of the trading post, Bible in one hand, pointing finger in the other, and his voice carried across the square like a crack of thunder. Around him, maybe 40 people had gathered, some on purpose, some simply caught in the current of his sermon. It didn't matter. They were all watching now, and I say to you, Pratt thundered, his pale eyes sweeping the crowd before landing. With terrible precision, on Margaret, that gluttony is a sin that wears no disguise. It walks among us. It sits at our tables. It takes from this community what does not belong to it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Margaret felt every single one of them land on her like a physical weight. Don't move. Don't react. Don't give them anything. She kept her jaw set. She kept her eyes forward. She had learned this discipline years ago, the art of standing still while the world tore at her, of becoming stone so the words would shatter against her instead of breaking through. But Pratt wasn't finished. He stepped down from the platform, Bible tucked under his arm now, and walked, slowly, deliberately, until he stood directly in front of her. The crowd parted for him like water. Margaret did not step back. Margaret Calloway, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice was soft now, almost gentle, which was worse than shouting. I have received letters from 3 families in this town. He paused, letting the words settle. Complaints. About you. About the excess you represent. About the way you parade yourself through this community as though your condition is something to be tolerated. The word condition landed like a slap. Someone in the crowd laughed. It was a small sound at first, just one person, but it spread. Another laugh joined it. Then another. Within seconds, it was a chorus, and Margaret felt something inside her chest crack, just slightly, like ice fracturing under weight. Don't cry. Don't you dare cry, I propose, Pratt continued, his voice rising again to fill the square, that we make it clear to Miss Calloway, and to anyone else who might follow her example, that this town has standards. That we do not welcome excess. That we do not celebrate. He gestured at her body with an open palm, casual and disgusted. The laughter grew louder. A child near the front of the crowd, a boy of maybe 8, tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, loud enough for Margaret to hear, "Why is she so big?" "Mama," his mother didn't shush him. She just looked at Margaret with something worse than cruelty. She looked at her with pity. Margaret's hands were shaking now. She clenched them into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. Her vision blurred at the edges, and for one terrible second she thought her legs might give out entirely. "Just walk away," something inside her whispered. Walk away before it gets worse, but she had nowhere to walk to. That was the cruelest truth of all. Millhaven was her world. The trading post was where she bought the supplies she needed to survive through winter. The families gathered here were the only people she had any dealings with. To leave would mean leaving everything, the small cabin on the edge of town. The garden she'd spent 3 years coaxing life from, the grave where her mother rested beneath an oak tree Margaret watered every spring. To leave would mean surrender, and Margaret Calloway had not survived 31 years of being hated to surrender now, so she stood. And she took it. Pratt was speaking again, something about community values, about setting an example, but his words had become a buzzing in Margaret's ears, indistinct and meaningless. The laughter continued around her, punctuated by shouts of agreement. Someone threw a piece of overripe fruit. It struck her shoulder and left a dark stain on her shawl, and then, silence, not gradual. Not fading. Sudden. Like someone had reached into the square and switched off the sound, Margaret blinked. The crowd had shifted. Not toward her, away from something behind her. Heads turned, shoulders drew back, and a gap opened in the gathering like a wound splitting open. Through that gap, a man walked. He was enormous. Not just tall, though he was that, easily 6'4", maybe more, but broad, built like something carved from oak and iron. His shoulders filled the space between bodies on either side of him without him touching a single person. He wore a long coat, dark and well-made but road-worn, and his boots were caked in mud. His face was angular, hard, with a jaw like granite and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray-green and utterly terrifyingly calm. He didn't hurry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked, and the crowd moved out of his way as though parting for a flood. Margaret had seen him before, everyone in Millhaven had, though few had ever spoken to him directly. His name was Elijah Crane. He owned the largest homestead in the region, a sprawling property 5 miles north of town, isolated and shrouded in a reputation darker than the woods that surrounded it. He was wealthy, obscenely so, by Millhaven standards, and he used that wealth like a wall, keeping the town at a distance while simultaneously depending on it for supplies and trade. He was feared. Not because he had ever hurt anyone, Margaret couldn't recall a single incident of violence tied to his name, but because of the possibility of it. He was too large, too quiet, too self-contained. People didn't know what to make of him, and what they couldn't understand, they feared. He stopped 10 feet from where Margaret stood, his eyes moved, not to her, not yet, but to Reverend Pratt. And in that single, sweeping glance, something shifted in the air. The temperature seemed to drop. The remaining laughter died instantly, as though each person who had been laughing suddenly remembered something important they had forgotten. Pratt cleared his throat. "Mr. Crane. This is a matter of, I heard what it is." Elijah's voice was low, unhurried, with a roughness to it like gravel shifting. He didn't look away from Pratt. "I heard it from the road." A beat of silence. "This woman," Elijah continued, and now, only now, his gaze moved to Margaret. She felt it land on her like something physical, warm and assessing, and for one disorienting second, she forgot where she was. His eyes traveled not with the cold, appraising disgust she was used to, but with something quieter. Something almost careful. As though he were reading fine print. Has committed no crime, Pratt opened his mouth. Elijah held up one hand, a single, unhurried gesture, and Pratt closed it again. You have letters, Elijah said. It wasn't a question. From families. Complaints about, what, exactly? Her weight, the silence was deafening now. Not a single person in the crowd moved, Pratt swallowed. It's a matter of moral character, Mr. Crane. Of the values this community, her moral character. Elijah repeated the words slowly, as though tasting them. Then he turned to face the crowd, all 40 of them, and his expression didn't change. It didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make every person there feel suddenly, acutely small. I have done business with this town for 11 years, he said, his voice carrying without effort. I have bought grain here. Paid for repairs here. Settled debts that weren't mine to settle, because it was easier than watching this town fall apart. He paused. And in 11 years. I have never once seen a single person in this square do a day's honest work the way that woman does. He nodded toward Margaret. She felt her breath catch. I have watched her carry firewood in the dead of winter. Alone. I have seen her tend a garden on soil that would defeat most men. I have watched her bury her mother and walk back into town the next morning like the world owed her nothing. His jaw tightened, the only crack in his composure. And you stand here and laugh at her, the silence stretched. A child coughed somewhere in the back of the crowd. Elijah turned back to Pratt. Tear up your letters, Reverend. Or I will tear up your church. It wasn't shouted. It was spoken in the same calm, measured tone he'd used for everything else. But the weight of it pressed down on the square like a physical force. Pratt's face had gone pale. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Mr. Crane, I hardly think, then don't think. Elijah held his gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough to make the point, long enough to make it permanent, before turning away. He walked back toward Margaret, stopping just beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the cold. He didn't offer his arm. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her, that same quiet, searching look, and said, in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "Can you walk?" Her throat was so tight she could barely breathe. But she nodded. "Good," he said. And then he turned and walked away, not toward the crowd, but toward the edge of the square, toward the road that led north, out of town, and after a beat of stunned, frozen silence, Margaret found her legs moving. Following, she didn't look back at Reverend Pratt. She didn't look back at the crowd, at the laughing faces now gone pale and quiet, at the mothers clutching their children a little tighter. She kept her eyes forward, on the broad, dark shape of Elijah Crane moving through the autumn wind, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the cracking inside her chest went quiet. Not healed. Not yet, but quiet. The road north was long, and neither of them spoke. Margaret walked 3 paces behind Elijah Crane, close enough to follow, far enough to remind herself that she was not, in any sense, his. She owed him nothing, not gratitude, not obedience, not the kind of quiet deference that men in Millhaven expected from women who depended on them. He had spoken on her behalf, yes. He had silenced Pratt and shamed the crowd. But Margaret had learned the hard way that kindness from powerful men always came with a cost, and she had no intention of paying it blindly. Still, her legs carried her forward. Because the truth was simple and ugly, she had nowhere else to go. The wind picked up as the town fell away behind them, replaced by stretches of dry grass and skeletal trees stripped bare by autumn. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy and low, and the air carried the first bitter bite of real cold, the kind that promised a brutal winter ahead. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking. Elijah didn't slow down. He didn't check to see if she was keeping up. He simply moved, long strides eating the distance, and Margaret had to push her pace to match him. Her boots were thin, resoled twice, the leather cracked and worn through in places, and the mud sucked at her feet with every step. By the time the homestead came into view, her toes were numb. She saw it before she expected to. A large structure, not quite a mansion, but substantial, built from dark timber and stone, 2 stories tall with a wide porch and shuttered windows. Behind it, a barn, a smokehouse, a well. The property was sprawling but unkempt, the kind of place that had once been maintained with care but had since been abandoned to neglect. Firewood was stacked in uneven piles near the door. The porch railing was cracked in 2 places. A fence that might have once enclosed a garden had collapsed entirely, leaving nothing but a tangle of dead vines and frozen earth. It looked, Margaret thought, like a house that had given up. Elijah opened the front door without ceremony and stepped inside. After a moment, he turned back and looked at her, still standing at the bottom of the porch steps, her hands wrapped around her shawl, her breath coming in small white clouds. "Well," he said. "Are you coming in or not?" Margaret climbed the steps. The interior hit her like a wall of cold. The fireplace was dark, no embers, no warmth, just a black mouth of ash and old wood. The furniture was sparse, a heavy table, 2 chairs, a worn settle near the hearth. There were dishes stacked in the dry sink, unwashed. A cast-iron pot hung in the fireplace, empty and rusted. The floors were swept but not clean. The walls were bare. No curtains on the windows. No quilts on the settle. Nothing soft, nothing warm, nothing that suggested a human being lived here rather than simply existed. Margaret stood in the middle of the main room and looked around, and something in her chest tightened, not with pity, exactly, but with recognition. She knew what a house looked like when someone had stopped caring about living. She had seen it in her own home, after her mother died, when the grief had hollowed her out and left her going through the motions of survival without any of the warmth that made survival bearable. This house was grief made physical. Every bare wall, every cold surface, every shadow in the corners, it was all grief. Elijah had moved to the fireplace and was building a fire with efficient, practiced movements. He didn't look at her. He didn't explain himself. He simply worked, striking flint, coaxing the kindling to catch, feeding larger pieces of wood until the flames took hold and began to push back the darkness. "There's a bedroom upstairs," he said, without turning around. "Second door on the left. It's clean. The bed has blankets." Margaret didn't move. "And where will you sleep?" He glanced back at her then, just a flash of those storm-colored eyes. "Down here." A beat of silence passed between them. Margaret nodded, once, and said nothing more. She understood the arrangement, even if it hadn't been spoken aloud. She was here. She would stay. And whatever unwritten rules governed this space, they would figure them out as they went. She climbed the stairs. The bedroom was exactly as he described, small, sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed, a wool blanket folded at the foot, and a single window that looked out over the back of the property toward the tree line. The air was cold but still, and Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against the mattress, feeling the give of it beneath her hands. It had been months since she'd slept on anything softer than her own cabin floor. She did not cry. She had cried enough in her life. Instead, she sat in the quiet and let the stillness settle around her like snow, and she breathed, and she listened to the faint crackle of the fire below. And slowly, slowly, the trembling in her hands began to stop. The first morning, Margaret woke before dawn, old habit. Her body had been trained by years of solitary survival to rise with the light, and even in an unfamiliar bed, in an unfamiliar house, the instinct held. She dressed quickly in the dim gray light filtering through the window, smoothed the blanket back into place, and came downstairs. Elijah was already up. He sat at the table with a cup of black coffee, staring at nothing in particular, and when she appeared at the bottom of the stairs, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between surprise and assessment, as though he hadn't fully expected her to still be there. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. Margaret poured herself a cup and sat across from him. The fire had burned down to embers overnight, and the room was still cold, her breath visible in the air between them. She wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth seep into her fingers. They sat in silence for a long time. It was Margaret who broke it, eventually, not because she felt compelled to fill the quiet, but because practicality demanded it. "I need to know what's in the stores," she said. "If we're going to make it through winter, I need to know what you have and what you're missing." Elijah looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of recalibration. As though she had just said something he hadn't anticipated. "Smokehouse is out back," he said. "There's flour in the barn. Some dried beans. Salt. Not much else. How much firewood?" "Enough for a month. Maybe 6 weeks if the cold isn't bad." "It's going to be bad," Margaret said quietly. She had felt it in the air the day before, that particular sharpness that came before a brutal winter. She had lived in this region long enough to read the signs. "We need more wood. We need more food. And we need to patch that fence before the ground freezes solid, or whatever you're planning to grow come spring won't survive the animals." Elijah studied her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You know a lot about this." "I know what it takes to survive," Margaret said. It wasn't a boast. It was simply a fact, the one fact about herself she had never doubted, no matter how many other truths the world had tried to rewrite. Something in Elijah's expression softened, just barely, just enough for her to catch it, before he looked away and stood from the table. "Then show me," he said. And so it began. Margaret threw herself into the work the way a drowning woman throws herself toward shore, with everything she had, every ounce of skill and knowledge and stubborn, relentless will. She started in the kitchen, because the kitchen was where a house began to breathe. She cleaned the cast iron pot until it gleamed. She scrubbed the dry sink, organized the sparse pantry, and made a list of what was needed and what was critical and what could wait. She found a garden plot behind the smokehouse, buried under dead weeds and frost-hardened earth, but there, and she spent 2 full days clearing it, turning the soil with a spade she found in the barn, preparing it for the root vegetables that might still be coaxed into the ground before the freeze set in fully. The first meal she cooked was a simple thing. Dried beans simmered with salt and a handful of wild herbs she found growing along the creek bed, served with thick slices of bread she baked from the flour in the barn. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't anything close to a feast. But when she set the bowl in front of Elijah that evening and he took the first bite, something happened to his face that Margaret had never seen before. He closed his eyes. It lasted only a second, a brief, involuntary surrender to the warmth and the taste and the simple, profound comfort of a meal made with care. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright, and he didn't look at her. He just picked up the spoon and kept eating, and Margaret turned back to the stove and said nothing, and the silence between them was no longer empty, it was full. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Margaret cooked. She cleaned. She organized and repaired and tended, turning the frozen, neglected homestead into something that slowly, grudgingly, began to resemble a home. Elijah, for his part, worked from dawn until dark on the land, chopping wood, reinforcing the barn, clearing brush, preparing for winter with the grim efficiency of a man who had done it alone for years and was not yet accustomed to help. They spoke when they needed to. Directions. Questions about supplies. Practical exchanges that kept the household running. But beneath the practicality, something else was taking root, something quieter, harder to name, growing in the spaces between their words like a vine finding light in a crack. Margaret noticed it in small ways. The way Elijah's gaze would linger on her sometimes, not with hunger or appraisal, but with something closer to wonder, as though he were seeing something in her that surprised him. The way he never once, not in a single interaction, not in a passing glance, looked at her body with disgust. In a world that had spent her entire life teaching her to be ashamed of the space she occupied, his indifference to it was almost more disorienting than cruelty would have been. And then there were the things he did without comment. One morning, Margaret came downstairs to find a pair of boots by the door, sturdy, well-made, lined with wool, in exactly her size. No note. No explanation. Elijah was already outside, splitting wood, and when she stepped onto the porch and held up the boots, he glanced at her feet, at the cracked, worn shoes she'd been wearing since before her mother died, and then looked away, saying nothing. "These are for me?" she asked. "Your old ones won't last the week," he said, not looking up from his work. The axe came down with a clean crack. "Winter's coming." Margaret looked down at the boots in her hands. They were warm. They were beautiful, in their practical, unassuming way. And he had bought them, or made them, she couldn't tell, without being asked, without expecting thanks, without drawing any attention to the gesture at all. She put them on. They fit perfectly. A week later, she found a bolt of dark blue wool fabric folded on the kitchen table. Again, no note. Again, Elijah said nothing when she asked, simply shrugged one shoulder and muttered something about the cold getting worse. Margaret ran her fingers over the fabric, soft, thick, the kind of material that would make a warm coat or a heavy quilt, and felt something shift inside her chest. A loosening. A crack in the eyes she had built around herself, letting something warm seep through. She didn't thank him. She understood, instinctively, that he didn't want thanks. What he wanted, what he needed, was simply to be useful. To make someone's life better without having to say so. It was the language of a man who had forgotten how to speak in any other way, and Margaret understood that language, because it was her own. By the third week, the house had transformed. Not dramatically, the walls were still bare, the furniture still sparse, but the feeling of it had changed. There was always a fire burning now, always something simmering on the stove, always the smell of bread or stew or roasted root vegetables filling the air. Margaret had hung dried herbs from the kitchen rafters, their fragrance mingling with the wood smoke. She had found a heavy quilt in a chest in the barn, moth-eaten in places, but salvageable, and repaired it with careful stitches. Draping it over the back of the settle by the fire, one evening, after dinner, Elijah sat in the settle with a cup of coffee, and Margaret sat on the floor nearby, mending a tear in one of his work shirts by firelight. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. The fire crackled. The wind moved against the shutters outside. And Margaret, without quite meaning to, began to hum, a low, tuneless melody her mother used to sing while she worked. She stopped abruptly when she realized what she was doing, glancing up at Elijah to see if he'd noticed. He had. He was watching her over the rim of his cup, and his expression was open. Unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Not smiling, exactly, but something close to it. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as a smile. "Don't stop," he said quietly. Margaret held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the shirt in her hands, and after a beat, she began to hum again. The fire burned on. The wind pushed against the walls. And somewhere in the frozen space between two wounded people, something fragile and unnamed began, very slowly, to grow. The storm came on a Tuesday. Margaret felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air, a heaviness that settled into her bones like a warning. She had been outside that morning, checking the root cellar beneath the smokehouse. When the sky turned a color she had only seen once before in her life, a deep, bruised green, the kind that meant the weather wasn't just coming. It was angry. She found Elijah at the barn, mending a section of fence he'd reinforced the week before. He looked up when her shadow fell across the doorway, and something in her expression must have told him everything, because he set down his tools immediately and walked outside. He lifted his face to the sky, and she watched the color drain from his jaw as he read what she had already read. "How long?" he asked. "Hours," Margaret said. Maybe less. They moved fast after that. Elijah hauled firewood, armload after armload, stacking it inside the barn and then carrying the driest pieces onto the porch. Close enough to grab without stepping off into the dark. Margaret ran back and forth between the house and the root cellar, pulling up sacks of dried beans and potatoes, filling every pot and barrel she could find with water from the well before the wind got bad enough to make the trip dangerous. They worked in silence, the way they had learned to work together over the past weeks, not needing words, each anticipating what the other would do next, moving around one another with an ease that had taken shape so gradually neither of them had noticed it forming. By midday, the first flakes were falling. By 2 o'clock, the wind hit the house like a fist. Margaret had seen bad storms before. She had weathered them alone in her small cabin in Millhaven, listening to the wind scream through the cracks in the walls while she huddled under every blanket she owned. But this was different. This was monstrous. The kind of storm that didn't just blow, it howled, a sound so loud and so relentless that it felt alive, pressing against the windows, rattling the shutters, filling the house with a noise that made rational thought almost impossible. The fire roared in the hearth, fed by the wood Elijah had stacked beside it. Margaret sat on the settle, wrapped in the quilt she had repaired weeks ago, watching the flames dance and listening to the storm rage outside. Elijah sat in the chair across from her. Elbows on his knees, hands clasped, staring into the fire with an expression that had gone somewhere far away, somewhere Margaret couldn't follow. She had seen that look before. Not on him, on herself, in the weeks after her mother's death, when the grief had become so heavy it pulled her underwater and she couldn't find the surface. It was the look of a man drowning in something that had no bottom. "Elijah," she said, softly. He didn't respond. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white where his fingers were interlaced. The firelight moved across his face in shifting patterns, and Margaret realized with a start that his eyes were glassy, not with tears, exactly, but with something close. Something held back with tremendous, painful effort. "Elijah," she said again, louder this time. He blinked. Looked at her. And for one raw, unguarded second, she saw it, the full weight of whatever lived inside him, the thing he carried like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold and immovable. Then the wall came back up, smooth and practiced, and he looked away. "The storm will pass by morning," he said. His voice was flat. Controlled. "We have enough wood." "Enough food," Margaret nodded. But she didn't look away from him. And she didn't change the subject. The hours crawled by, the storm did not relent. If anything, it worsened as night fell, the wind rising to a pitch that sounded less like weather and more like something screaming. The house shuddered with each gust, and at one point a section of the roof let out a groan so deep and ominous that Margaret's stomach dropped. "Is that," she started, "the east side?" Elijah said. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, moving toward the door with a grim certainty that told her this wasn't the first time the storm had found a weakness. "Stay here." "No," Margaret said, and she was standing too, already reaching for her coat. "You're not going out there alone." He turned to look at her, and something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, or something sharper. "Margaret," I said no. Her voice was steady. Firm. The voice of a woman who had spent 31 years being told what she could and couldn't do. And had long since stopped listening. "Tell me what needs doing." Elijah held her gaze for a long beat. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. They went out into the storm together. The cold hit Margaret like a physical blow, a wall of ice and wind so fierce it stole the breath from her lungs before she could draw it. The snow was already knee-deep in places, driven sideways by the wind into drifts that hadn't been there an hour before. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her. Elijah's hand found her arm in the dark, his grip firm and sure, and he guided her along the side of the house toward the east wall where the roof had begun to give. She could hear it now, a tearing sound. Like cloth being ripped by hand, coming from somewhere above them. A section of shingles had come loose, and the wind was peeling them back one by one, exposing the bare wood beneath to the storm and the cold and the snow that would work its way inside and rot the structure from within if it wasn't stopped. Elijah assessed the damage in seconds. Then he looked at Margaret, and she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of risk against necessity, the awareness that if the roof failed completely, the storm would be inside the house before dawn. "I need to get up there," he said, raising his voice over the wind. "I need you to hold the ladder." Margaret planted her feet and gripped the base of the ladder with both hands, bracing it against the ground while Elijah climbed. The wind tore at her from every direction, and she squeezed her eyes shut against the stinging snow, and she held. Her arms burned. Her fingers went numb. The ladder swayed and groaned, and above her she could hear Elijah working, hammering, prying, securing, his movements quick and sure despite the conditions. It took 20 minutes. It felt like an hour. When he came down, his face was white with cold and his hands were bleeding where the wind-driven ice had cut into his skin. He grabbed Margaret's arm again and they stumbled back toward the house, leaning into each other against the force of the storm, and when they finally fell through the front door and shut it behind them. The sudden absence of the wind was so shocking that Margaret's ears rang with the silence. They stood in the entryway, dripping and shaking, breathing hard. Elijah's chest was heaving, and his hands, Margaret noticed them now, properly, were torn raw, the knuckles split and bleeding freely, rivulets of red running down his wrists and dripping onto the wooden floor. "Let me see," she said, and reached for his hands before he could pull away. He didn't pull away. Margaret led him to the settle by the fire and sat him down. She found a clean cloth, a basin of water, and a small tin of salve she had made herself from herbs and rendered fat, something she always kept on hand. Because in Margaret's experience, the world always found ways to wound you, and you had to be ready to tend those wounds yourself. She knelt in front of him and took his hands in hers, cradling them gently, turning them so the firelight fell across the torn skin. The cuts were deep in places, not dangerous, but painful. She dipped the cloth in water and began to clean them, slowly and carefully, the way her mother had taught her to tend wounds when she was a girl. Elijah watched her work. He said nothing. His breathing had steadied, but his jaw was still tight, and his eyes, those storm-colored eyes, moved across her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "You didn't have to come out there," he said, after a long silence. His voice was rough, rougher than usual, stripped of its usual careful control. "Yes, I did," Margaret said, without looking up. She wrung out the cloth, dipped it again, kept working. "The roof needed fixing. You needed help." It was practical. A beat passed. Then, it wasn't practical. It was dangerous. Most things worth doing are. She felt his hands shift in hers, a small, involuntary movement, his fingers curling slightly around hers before going still again. Margaret kept her eyes on the wounds, kept her hands steady, kept her breathing even. But something inside her chest had begun to beat faster. A rhythm she hadn't felt in years, the rhythm of being seen. She finished cleaning the cuts and began applying the salve, working it gently into the raw skin with her fingertips. Elijah's hands were enormous compared to hers, thick-fingered, calloused, built for heavy work, and yet they trembled slightly beneath her touch. Not from cold. From something else entirely, Margaret. His voice was barely above a whisper now. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, open, raw, exposed, as though the storm had stripped away not just shingles from the roof but every layer of armor he had built around himself. His eyes were bright. And his jaw was working, and for a terrible, suspended moment, Margaret thought he was going to say something that would change everything between them. Instead, he closed his eyes. Drew a breath. And when he opened them again, the wall was back, not as high as before, not as solid, but there. "A dam holding back a flood. My wife died," he said. The words fell into the quiet like stones into still water. Margaret didn't move. Didn't speak. She simply held his hands and waited. Her name was Clara. His voice was flat now, the voice of a man reciting facts because if he allowed himself to feel them, he would shatter. We had a daughter. She was 3 months old when Clara got sick. Fever. It spread fast, faster than I could get help out here. He swallowed. Clara died on a Wednesday. The baby died on Thursday. The fire popped. A log shifted in the grate, sending a shower of sparks into the air. I buried them both in the cemetery behind the house, Elijah continued. Side by side. And then I came back inside, and I sat in this room, and I didn't move for 2 weeks. He paused. When I finally got up, I didn't see the point of anything. Not the house. Not the land. Not any of it. His hands tightened around hers, just slightly, just enough for her to feel it. I kept going because I didn't know how to stop. That's all it was. Not living. Just continuing. Margaret held his gaze. Her own throat was tight, her own eyes burning, but she didn't look away. She understood what it cost him to say these words, understood it because she carried her own version of the same wound, the same quiet devastation that came from losing the people who were supposed to make the world bearable. I know what that feels like, she said. Her voice was steady, but soft, the voice of someone offering not pity, but recognition. After my mother died, I woke up every morning and asked myself why I bothered. Every single morning. For months, Elijah's eyes searched hers. What changed? Margaret thought about it. Really thought, turning the question over in her mind the way she might turn a stone in her hand. Feeling its weight and shape. Nothing changed, she said finally. I just kept going. One day at a time. Until one day, I woke up and realized that continuing wasn't so different from living after all. She squeezed his hands, gently, carefully, mindful of the wounds beneath her fingers. It's not the same as happiness. But it's something. It's enough. Elijah looked down at their joined hands, her smaller, rougher fingers wrapped around his larger, bleeding ones, and something moved across his face. Not a smile. Not yet. But the ghost of one. The possibility of one. The first green shoot pushing through frozen ground after a long, brutal winter. They sat like that for a long time, hands intertwined. Firelight moving across their faces, the storm howling outside but muffled now, distant, as though the house had drawn a circle around them that the wind couldn't penetrate. Margaret didn't let go, and Elijah didn't pull away. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the way storms always do, not with drama, but with a quiet, gradual easing, the wind dropping from a scream to a moan to a whisper, and then to nothing at all. Margaret woke on the settle, still wrapped in the quilt, to find pale gray light filtering through the windows and a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. Elijah was gone from the chair across from her. She found him outside, standing on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hands, his bandaged hands. She noticed, the white cloth she had wrapped around him the night before still in place, surveying the damage the storm had left behind. The world was buried in white. Snow covered everything, smooth and unbroken, and the air was so cold it burned her lungs when she stepped out beside him. He didn't look at her. But his shoulder was close to hers, closer than it needed to be, and when a gust of wind pushed Margaret sideways, he shifted, just slightly, so that his body blocked the worst of it. He didn't say anything about it. She didn't either, but the distance between them had closed, in the night, by a fraction. And neither of them moved to widen it again. Spring came slowly that year. The way it always did in that part of the country, not with a burst of warmth, but with a grudging, incremental thaw, the snow retreating inch by inch from the land like a tide pulling back from shore. The creek behind the homestead swelled with meltwater. The mud turned soft and treacherous. And the trees, bare and skeletal for months, began to show the first faint blush of green at their tips, so subtle you had to know to look for it. Margaret noticed every single one of these changes. She had spent the winter learning this land the way she had learned her own body, by paying attention, by listening, by understanding its rhythms and its moods. And somewhere in the process, without her quite realizing it, the homestead had stopped being Elijah's house that she was staying in, and had become something else entirely. Something shared. Something hers, in a way that mattered more than any deed or legal claim ever could. She was in the kitchen one morning in late March, kneading bread dough on the scarred wooden table, when the sound of hoofbeats reached her ears. She stopped. Lifted her head. Listened. 2 horses. Moving fast. Coming up the road from Millhaven, Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. Through the wavy glass, she could see them now, 2 riders cresting the rise at the edge of the property. One she didn't recognize, a thin man in a dark coat, riding a black mare with an air of self-importance that sat poorly on his narrow shoulders. The other she recognized immediately, and the sight of him turned her blood to ice. Reverend Elias Pratt. He sat his horse like a man on a mission, Bible tucked under one arm, his pale face set in an expression of righteous determination that Margaret knew all too well. She had seen it in the square, that October day. She had felt the weight of it pressing down on her like a thumb on a bruise. Her hands began to shake, the front door opened behind her, and Elijah stepped inside from the yard, mud on his boots and sawdust in his hair. He had been working on the barn again, reinforcing the roof after the winter storm had taken its toll, and his face was flushed from the cold. He looked at Margaret. Saw her expression. Followed her gaze to the window, his jaw tightened. "Stay here," he said. "No," Margaret said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. Not this time. Elijah looked at her, really looked, the way he had learned to look at her over these months, with that quiet, searching attention that saw past the surface of things. Whatever he found in her expression must have satisfied him, because he nodded, once, and turned back toward the door. They went out together. Pratt dismounted before they reached the porch, moving with the careful, practiced grace of a man who was used to being watched. The other rider, the thin man in the dark coat, followed suit, pulling a leather satchel from his saddle and clutching it to his chest like a shield. Margaret noticed, with a cold clarity, that the man had the look of a lawyer, the careful posture, the precise movements, the way his eyes swept the property with an appraising calculation that had nothing to do with admiration. "Mr. Crane," Pratt said, stopping at the base of the porch steps. His voice carried the same measured authority Margaret remembered from the square, smooth, controlled, designed to fill space and leave no room for interruption. "I hope we're not intruding." Elijah descended the porch steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood on the ground before Pratt, close enough that the height difference between them became impossible to ignore. Elijah towered over the Reverend by a full 6 inches, and he used every one of them, drawing himself up to his full height with an ease that was almost casual. His hands hung at his sides, relaxed, but his eyes were cold and steady, the eyes of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to end. "You are," Elijah said. Simply. Flatly. Pratt's smile didn't waver, but something behind it flickered, a crack in the composure, quickly smoothed over. "I'll make this brief, then." He turned his gaze to Margaret, standing on the porch behind Elijah, and the look he gave her was one she knew intimately, the slow, deliberate sweep from head to toe, the slight curl of the lip. The silent, comprehensive dismissal. "Miss Calloway." Margaret met his eyes and said nothing. Pratt turned back to Elijah. "This is Mr. Gerald Howe," he said, gesturing to the thin man with the satchel. "An attorney, from the county seat. He's here on behalf of the town council of Millhaven." "I don't care who he's here on behalf of," Elijah said. "State your business." Pratt's smile thinned. He nodded to Howe, who stepped forward and opened his satchel with trembling fingers, pulling out a folded document. He cleared his throat, a dry, papery sound, and began to speak in a voice that was too high and too fast, the voice of a man who had rehearsed his words but was still afraid of the man he was saying them to. "Mr. Crane, Miss Calloway. The town council of Millhaven has filed a formal complaint regarding Miss Calloway's residence on your property. He unfolded the document and held it up, though neither Elijah nor Margaret moved to take it. Specifically, the council has determined that Miss Calloway's arrangement with you constitutes a violation of public decency ordinances. An unmarried woman living in the home of an unmarried man, without family or chaperone, she's not living in my home, Elijah said, cutting him off with a single, flat sentence. She's working here. As my housekeeper. It's an employment arrangement. Nothing more. Hal blinked. Looked down at his document. Looked back up. Mr. Crane, the council is not satisfied with that explanation. Given the circumstances, what circumstances? Elijah's voice dropped lower. Quieter. The way it did when he was genuinely angry, not loud, but dense, packed tight with a force that made the air feel heavy. Pratt stepped forward, and Margaret saw it now, the thing she had missed before, or chosen not to see. The satisfaction in his eyes. The gleam of it. This wasn't about decency or ordinances or the moral fiber of the community. This was personal. This was Elijah Crane humiliating him in front of 40 people in a public square, and Pratt had spent the entire winter finding a way to make him pay for it. The circumstances, Pratt said, his voice smooth as river stone, are that Miss Calloway is a woman of questionable reputation, residing alone with a man who has no legal claim to her. The council feels it is their duty to act. We are here to inform you that Miss Calloway must vacate this property within 30 days, or the county will take action to enforce the ordinance. He paused, letting the words settle. Forcibly, if necessary. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret felt it land in her chest, the old, familiar weight of it, the crushing pressure of being reduced, of having her existence turned into a problem to be solved, a stain to be scrubbed from the fabric of decent society. 31 years of this. 31 years of being told she didn't belong, didn't deserve, wasn't enough. And now, even here, even in this place she had spent months rebuilding with her own hands, pouring warmth and life and care into every corner, they had followed her, her vision blurred at the edges. She gripped the porch railing behind her, knuckles white, and breathed. Don't break. Not here. Not in front of him. Elijah hadn't moved. Hadn't blinked. He stood with his back to Margaret, his broad shoulders square, his hands still hanging at his sides. And when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Margaret had to strain to hear it. You're going to leave, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement, delivered with the same calm, measured certainty he had used in the square that first day, the authority of a man who had already seen the end of this scene and was simply waiting for the other players to catch up. Pratt's smile faltered. Mr. Crane, you're going to leave, Elijah repeated. And you're going to tear up that document. And you're going to go back to Millhaven and tell the council that Margaret Calloway is not going anywhere. Hal shifted nervously, the document trembling in his hands. Pratt's jaw tightened, but his eyes, his pale, calculating eyes, were moving quickly now, reassessing, measuring the man in front of him against the power he represented. Elijah Crane's wealth was not a secret. His influence in the region was not a secret. The fact that he had, over 11 years of careful, strategic dealing, made himself indispensable to the economic survival of Millhaven and half a dozen surrounding towns, that was not a secret either. Pratt knew exactly what it would cost to push this fight. He simply hadn't expected Elijah to push back this hard. The law is on our side, Mr. Crane, Pratt said, but the conviction had drained from his voice, replaced by something harder to read, a careful, political neutrality, the tone of a man recalculating his position in real time. Elijah took one step forward. Just one. But it closed the distance between them 2 inches. And Pratt, for the first time, stepped back. The law, Elijah said, is a tool. And tools can be turned around. He let that sit for a moment. Then, I own the building your church sits on, Reverend. I own the land your school is built on. I have provided loans to 14 families in Millhaven, loans that have not yet been repaid. His voice was steady, unhurried, each fact delivered like a card laid on a table. I am not threatening you. I am simply making sure you understand the full picture before you make a decision you can't take back. The silence stretched. A bird sang somewhere in the trees behind the barn, a thin, bright sound, absurdly cheerful against the tension coiled in the yard. Pratt's face had gone very still. He looked at Howe. Howe looked at the document in his hands, then at Elijah, then back at Pratt. Something passed between them, a silent exchange, a shared recognition that the ground had shifted beneath their feet and the position they had come here to claim was no longer available. Pratt straightened his coat. Smoothed the front of it with both hands, a nervous gesture Margaret noticed, that he probably wasn't aware he was making. Then he looked at Margaret, and for one long, brutal moment, his eyes were naked with fury, the raw, wounded pride of a man who had been outmaneuvered and knew it. Margaret held his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She stood on the porch of the home she had rebuilt with her own hands, beside the man who had chosen her, chosen this, chosen them, and she let him see exactly who she was, not the woman from the square. Not the shamed, silent creature who had stood in the crowd and taken the laughter and the fruit thrown at her body and the condemnation of a man who had never once questioned his own right to judge her, someone else. Someone harder. Someone who had survived the worst this town could throw at her and come out the other side unbroken. Pratt held her stare for 3 seconds. Then he looked away first. He turned to his horse without another word, mounted in one fluid motion, and pulled the reins tight. Howe followed, stuffing the document back into his satchel with fumbling hands, not meeting anyone's eyes. The two horses turned and began the long ride back down the road toward Millhaven, and Margaret watched them go, watched until they crested the rise and disappeared from view, and then she let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for months. The yard was quiet again. The spring wind moved through the bare trees, carrying the smell of wet earth and thaw. Margaret's hands were still shaking, but the shaking was different now, not fear, but release. The loosening of something that had been wound too tight for too long. She turned to look at Elijah. He was watching her. Standing exactly where he had stood during the confrontation, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable in that way it sometimes was, not cold, but full, packed with things he didn't know how to say out loud. His eyes moved over her face, slowly, the way they had that first day in the square, and Margaret felt the weight of his gaze like something physical, warm, steady, and impossibly gentle for a man built the way he was. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw by the emotion she had been holding back. The loans. The property. All of it. You didn't have to use all of that. Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Then he took a step toward her, just one, closing the distance between them by half, and when he spoke, his voice was low and quiet, stripped of everything except the truth. "Yes," he said. "I did." The words hung in the air between them, simple and absolute, and Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, not painfully, but fully, the way a seed cracks open to let the green thing inside finally reach the light. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said for them. Elijah held her gaze for one more beat. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, toward the work that was waiting, toward the life they were building together one day at a time. Margaret watched him go, and then she turned back toward the house, toward the kitchen, the bread dough still waiting on the table, the warmth of the fire, the smell of flour and wood smoke that had become, without her quite noticing, the smell of home. She climbed the porch steps. Paused at the door. Looked back, one last time, at the road where Pratt and Howe had disappeared. They were gone. The road was empty. The spring wind blew cold and clean across the yard, carrying nothing but the promise of what was coming next. Margaret stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The bread dough was still warm when Margaret returned to the kitchen. She stood at the table for a moment. Her hands resting on the edge of it, feeling the slight give of the wood beneath her palms, worn smooth by years of use, scarred in places by knife marks and heat burns, but solid. Enduring. She looked down at the dough, at the flour dusting her fingers, and something loosened inside her that she hadn't known was still tight. Pratt was gone. The document was gone. The threat, the latest in a long, unbroken line of threats that had followed her through her entire life like a shadow she could never outrun, was gone, and she was still here. Margaret pressed her fists into the dough and began to knead, and the rhythm of it, the push, the fold, the turn, settled over her like a blanket. Familiar and grounding, and she let it carry her forward into the rest of the day. Spring deepened around the homestead over the weeks that followed, and with it came a kind of quiet transformation that Margaret watched unfold the way you watch a painting come to life, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you step back and realize the whole picture has changed. The ground thawed fully by mid-April, turning the yard into a patchwork of mud and new green. The creek swelled with snowmelt, running fast and bright over the stones. And the garden, Margaret's garden, the one she had cleared and turned and coaxed back to life through the brutal months of winter, began tentatively to grow. It started with the potatoes. Pale green shoots pushing up through the dark earth, fragile and determined, reaching for the light with an urgency that reminded Margaret of something she couldn't quite name. She knelt in the dirt one morning to check on them, her hands buried up to the wrists in the cool, damp soil, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. Elijah found her there, an hour later, still on her knees in the garden, her face flushed and her hair coming loose from its braid. He stood at the edge of the plot and watched her work for a moment before she noticed him. When she looked up, he was leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed. And there was something on his face she had been seeing more and more often in recent weeks, a softness, barely there, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Margaret was looking. She had been looking for a long time. They're growing, he said. A simple observation. But the way he said it, quiet, almost reverent, told her he understood what it meant. Not just the potatoes. Everything. Margaret smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of the lips, but it was real, and Elijah saw it, and something in his expression shifted, warmed, in a way that made Margaret's chest ache with a feeling she was only beginning to allow herself to name. The days lengthened. The work continued, always the work, the endless, sustaining rhythm of it, but it was lighter now, carried by two sets of hands instead of one, shared in a way that made even the hardest tasks feel manageable. Elijah worked the land with the same grim efficiency he always had, but there was a looseness to him now, a ease in his body that hadn't been there before. He whistled sometimes while he worked, tuneless, absent-minded, the way Margaret hummed when she cooked, and when she heard it drifting from the barn or the field, she felt something warm and steady settle in her chest, like an ember catching in dry kindling. They talked more, too. Not about grand things, not yet, but about small ones. The weather. The garden. The condition of the fences. Whether the creek would flood if the rain kept up. Practical conversations, the kind that kept a household running, but woven through with something else, a current of warmth, of attention, of two people gradually learning the shape of each other's minds and finding, with quiet surprise, that the shape fit. One evening in late April, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun go down over the western ridge. The sky was enormous, a wash of gold and rose and deep, burning violet, and the air was warm enough to sit in without coats for the first time all year. Margaret had her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. And Elijah had his coffee, and they sat in the comfortable silence that had become their default, the silence of two people who no longer needed words to fill the space between them. The crickets had begun to sing. Margaret listened to them, their high, rhythmic chorus rising from the tall grass beyond the fence, and thought about how different this moment was from the one that had started all of this, the square in Millhaven, the laughter, the fruit thrown at her body, the cold wind cutting through her worn shawl. It felt like another lifetime. It felt like it had happened to someone else entirely. Margaret, she turned her head. Elijah was looking at her, not with his usual quiet intensity, but with something rawer, something that lived closer to the surface. His hands were wrapped around his cup, and his jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working up to saying something difficult, tightening, releasing, tightening again. "I want to tell you something," he said. And then he stopped. Looked down at his coffee. Looked back up. Margaret waited. She had learned, over these months, that Elijah spoke the way he moved through the world, deliberately, carefully, never rushing. Words cost him something, and he spent them only when he was sure of their weight. So she waited, and let him find his way to whatever it was he needed to say. "When you first came here," he began, slowly, "I didn't know what you were going to do. I brought you here because," he paused. Shook his head, as though rejecting his own phrasing. Started again. "I saw you. In the square. And I saw what they were doing to you. And I couldn't." Another pause. His jaw tightened. "I couldn't let it keep happening. So I brought you here. And I told myself it was practical. That it was just shelter. Something to keep you alive through winter." He looked at her then, and the rawness in his eyes made Margaret's breath catch. "It wasn't practical," he said. "It was never practical. I brought you here because I wanted you here. Because the moment I saw you standing in that square, taking what they threw at you without breaking, I knew." He swallowed hard. "I knew you were someone I wanted in my life. And I didn't know how to say that. I still don't, entirely. But I'm saying it now, because I think you deserve to hear it." The cricket sang on. The last light faded from the sky, leaving the stars to emerge, one by one, cold and bright and ancient. Margaret sat very still, her hands wrapped around her cup, and felt the words settle over her like rain on parched ground, soaking in slowly, deeply, reaching parts of her that had been dry for so long she had forgotten they could feel anything at all. She set down her cup. Turned to face him fully. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, not because she wasn't feeling everything, but because she had spent a lifetime learning to be steady in the moments that mattered most. "I spent 31 years believing I wasn't worth choosing," she said. "Not because I believed it myself, but because everyone around me did. And after a while, it becomes hard to tell the difference between what other people think and what you know to be true." She held his gaze. "You made it possible for me to tell the difference again. Not by telling me I was worth something, but by showing me. Every day. The boots. The fabric. The way you look at me, like I'm not too much. Like I'm exactly enough." Her voice wavered, just slightly, on the last word. She steadied it. "So yes," she said. "I want to be here. I want this. I want to stay." Elijah set down his coffee. He leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to pull back, and raised one hand. His fingers, scarred now, the cuts from the storm healed into thin white lines across his knuckles, came to rest against the side of her face, cupping her jaw with a gentleness that was almost shocking from hands so large, so capable of force. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He simply held her gaze, his thumb moving in a small, slow circle against her cheekbone, and the look in his eyes was one Margaret had never seen directed at her before, not in 31 years of being looked at, assessed, dismissed, and judged. It was reverence. It was wonder. It was the look of a man who had spent years believing he didn't deserve warmth, finding it anyway, in a place he never expected, in a woman the world had tried to throw away. "Stay," he said. It was barely a whisper. A prayer, almost. An offering. Margaret leaned into his hand. Closed her eyes. Felt the warmth of his palm against her skin, and the evening air moving through her hair, and the distant sound of the crickets singing their ancient, tireless song. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The kiss, when it came, was soft. Unhurried. The kind of kiss that wasn't the beginning of something, but the acknowledgement of something that had already begun, quietly. Gradually, in shared silences and small gestures and the slow, steady accumulation of days spent side by side, they sat on the porch for a long time after that, shoulders touching, watching the stars wheel overhead, and the silence between them was the fullest, warmest silence Margaret had ever known. Summer arrived with a generosity that felt almost deliberate, long golden days, warm nights, rain when the garden needed it and sun when it didn't. Margaret's garden exploded into life. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs, everything she planted seemed to reach for the sky with an enthusiasm that bordered on the joyful. She spent hours out there, on her knees in the dirt, her hands dark with soil. Her face flushed from the heat, and she felt, for the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Elijah watched her from the barn or the fence line, and sometimes Margaret would look up and catch him watching, and he would hold her gaze for a beat before looking away, but not quickly enough to hide the expression on his face. It was the same expression he'd worn on the porch that evening. Wonder. Gratitude. A quiet, steady joy that sat on him like sunlight on stone, warming him from the outside in, slowly, persistently, dissolving the cold that had lived in him for so long. They married in June. It was a small thing, no church, no congregation. No reverend. They rode into the county seat together on a bright morning, stood before a clerk in a wood-paneled office, and spoke the words that bound them to each other in the eyes of the law. Margaret wore a dress she had sewn herself from the bolt of blue wool Elijah had left on the kitchen table months ago, the fabric soft against her skin, the color of deep water, and it fit her perfectly, because she had made it to fit herself, without apology, without compromise, without shrinking any part of her body to make room for someone else's comfort. Elijah wore his good coat, the dark one, road-worn but well-made, and when the clerk pronounced them married and Elijah turned to look at her, the expression on his face was one Margaret would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not surprise. Not relief. Simply certainty. The look of a man who had finally arrived at a place he had been traveling toward for a very long time. They rode home in the late afternoon light, the road winding north through green fields and tall grass, and Margaret leaned against Elijah's shoulder and watched the landscape scroll past and felt something settle inside her, deep, permanent, like an anchor finding the bottom of the sea. She was home. The news of their marriage reached Millhaven within a week, the way news always did in small towns, carried on tongues from door to door, embellished and speculated upon, turned over and examined from every angle. Margaret heard about it secondhand, from a trader who passed through the homestead in July, and she listened to his account of the town's reaction with a calm that surprised even herself. Some people were scandalized. Others were simply confused, unable to reconcile the woman they had laughed at in the square with the woman who had married Elijah Crane. A few, Margaret suspected, were simply angry. Angry that she had escaped the fate they had assigned her. Angry that she had found happiness in spite of everything they had done to prevent it. Reverend Pratt, the trader mentioned, had left Millhaven in April. Quietly, without ceremony. Without explanation. The church he had led for 12 years stood empty now, its doors locked, its congregation scattered to other towns and other pastors. No one seemed to know, or care, where he had gone. Margaret listened to this, nodded, and poured the trader a cup of coffee. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel vindication. What she felt, sitting in her kitchen on a warm July afternoon with the windows open and the smell of bread baking and the sound of Elijah working somewhere outside, was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. She felt free. Autumn came again, the same season that had started everything, a full year ago now, and with it came a change Margaret hadn't expected. She noticed it first in the mornings, in a nausea that rose and fell with the tides of her body, unpredictable and insistent. She noticed it in the way certain smells, coffee, bacon fat, the sharp green scent of the garden after rain, suddenly made her stomach lurch. She noticed it in the tiredness that settled over her in the afternoons like a heavy blanket, pulling her toward sleep no matter how much rest she'd gotten the night before. She knew what it was before she allowed herself to think the word. She told Elijah on a Sunday evening, after dinner, sitting in the kitchen with the fire burning low and the last light of the day coming through the window in long, golden slants. She had been thinking about how to say it all day, turning the words over in her mind, testing their weight, bracing herself for the reaction. Not because she feared his anger or his disappointment, but because the stakes felt so enormous, so fragile, that even speaking the truth out loud felt like an act of courage. Elijah was sitting across from her, reading, or trying to. He had picked up a book from the shelf Margaret had organized months ago, and he held it open in his hands, but his eyes weren't moving across the page. He was watching her, she realized. Had been watching her for a while. Waiting for her to say whatever it was she was working up to saying. I think, Margaret began. And stopped. Started again. I think we're going to have a baby. The book closed in Elijah's hands. He set it down on the table, slowly, and looked at her. And Margaret watched his face, watched it move through something complex and deep, a tide of emotion that shifted and turned like water finding its way through stone. His eyes went bright. His jaw worked. His hands, resting on the table, curled into fists, not from anger, but from the effort of containing something that was too large for his body to hold. He stood up. Moved around the table. Knelt in front of her chair, so that he was looking up at her, and took her hands in his, gently, the way he had learned to touch her. With a care that still sometimes made her breath catch after all these months. Are you sure? He asked. His voice was rough. Stripped raw. I'm sure, Margaret said. Elijah closed his eyes. His grip on her hands tightened, not painfully, but with a fierceness that told her everything his words couldn't. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet, and the look in them was one Margaret had never seen before, not wonder, not reverence, but something deeper. Something that lived beneath all of those things, at the very bottom of a man's heart, where the oldest and most fundamental truths resided. Hope, okay, he said. And then, softer, okay, he pressed his forehead against her hands. And Margaret felt the warmth of his breath against her skin, and she brought one hand up and rested it on the back of his head, her fingers curling gently through his hair, and they stayed like that for a long time, kneeling together on the kitchen floor, hands intertwined, the fire crackling softly in the grate, the evening light fading to dusk outside the window. The baby came in the spring, a girl, small and loud and perfect, with Elijah's dark hair and Margaret's stubborn chin. They named her Clara, after the woman Elijah had lost, and when Margaret held the infant in her arms for the first time, warm and squirming and smelling of milk and new life, she looked up at Elijah and saw something on his face that made her heart ache with tenderness. He was crying. Quietly, without shame, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks, and he was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines and the guarded angles and revealing the man beneath, the man who had been buried under grief and isolation for years, finally surfacing. Hi, Clara, he whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek with one fingertip, so gently, so carefully, as though she were made of glass. I'm your dad. Margaret watched him, and she smiled, and she held their daughter close, and outside the window the spring sun was rising over the ridge, turning the sky to gold. The homestead hummed with life after that, a living, breathing, noisy thing, so different from the frozen, silent house Margaret had walked into a year before that it was almost hard to believe it was the same place. Clara's cries echoed through the halls in the early morning, answered by Margaret's soft singing and Elijah's low, rumbling voice. The kitchen was always warm, always fragrant with something cooking or baking. The garden stretched wide and green behind the house, tended with care, producing more than they could eat. The fence was mended. The barn was solid. The roof held fast against the rain, and at night, when Clara was sleeping and the house was quiet, Margaret and Elijah sat together on the porch, the way they had that first evening. Watching the stars come out, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of two strangers or two wounded people learning to coexist. It was the silence of a family. Of a home. Of two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their separate lives and built something whole from the broken pieces. Margaret leaned her head against Elijah's shoulder. His arm came around her, warm and steady, pulling her close. Clara slept inside, peaceful and dreaming, and the crickets sang their endless song in the tall grass beyond the fence, and the stars turned slowly overhead, ancient and indifferent and beautiful. Margaret closed her eyes. She was not the woman from the square anymore, the shamed, silent creature who had stood in the crowd and taken the laughter and the cruelty and the weight of 100 cruel gazes without breaking. She was not that woman, and she never would be again. She was Margaret Crane. She was a wife. She was a mother. She was a woman who had survived the worst the world could offer, and who had found, against all odds, against all expectation, that the world could also offer this, warmth. Belonging. Love, not despite her body. Not in spite of who she was. But because of it. Because of her softness, her strength, her abundance. Because she had refused, even at her lowest point, to disappear. Elijah pressed a kiss to the top of her head, light, unhurried, the way he did everything, and Margaret smiled against his shoulder, and the night settled around them like a blanket, and the story, their story, continued on, quiet and warm and full, into the years ahead.